The Dark Side of Elegance, 7 Bizarre Sexual Rules of the Victorian Era. Close your eyes and picture the Victorian era. What do you see? Perhaps you envision a world of impeccable manners and quiet dignity, a world of steam and steel, of empire and invention, all draped in velvet and lace. You see gentlemen in top hats, their pocket watches glinting under the soft glow of gas lights. You see ladies, their waists cinched impossibly tight, gliding through opulent ballrooms, their conversations a delicate dance of pleasantries and unspoken rules. It is an image of order, of propriety, of a society so thoroughly convinced of its own moral superiority that it sought to civilize the world. This is the Victorian era as it presented itself, a carefully constructed masterpiece of public virtue. But like any masterpiece, its beauty often lies in what it conceals. Beneath the starched collars and the voluminous crinoline skirts, beneath the polite smiles and the hushed conversations, lay a world of silent anxieties, forbidden desires, and profound confusion. It was an era at war with itself, a society obsessed with purity that simultaneously created the very shadows in which its darkest impulses could thrive. Tonight, we shall not walk the grand sunlit boulevards of Victorian society. Instead, we will venture into its private chambers, its hushed sick rooms, and the troubled recesses of its mind. We will pull back the velvet curtain to reveal the bizarre, often tragic, and deeply strange rules that governed the most intimate aspect of human existence: sex. These were not laws written in parliamentary ledgers, but rules etched into the very soul of a generation. This is the dark side of elegance.
Rule number 1. The angel in the house must have no desires. Our journey begins in the heart of the Victorian home, the supposed sanctuary from the grime and moral corruption of the industrial world outside. And at the center of this sanctuary was its reigning deity, the woman. She was not seen merely as a person, but as an ideal. She was the angel in the house, a term taken from a popular poem of the day. This angel was expected to be a paragon of virtue, pious, pure, submissive, and above all, domestic. Her purpose was to be a moral compass for her husband and a gentle guide for her children. She was the repository of all that was good and beautiful in the world. But this angelic status came at a terrible, dehumanizing price. For an angel to be truly pure, she must be free from the base, carnal desires that plagued mortal men. And so, the first and most fundamental rule was established. A good woman, a respectable woman, did not feel sexual desire. This was not merely a social preference, it was presented as scientific fact. The most influential medical man of the age, Dr. William Acton, wrote in his widely read treatise, The Functions and Disorders of the Reproductive Organs, that the majority of women are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. He declared that to suggest a modest woman would feel such urges was a vile aspersion. For the Victorian man, this was a convenient philosophy. It elevated his wife to a saintly pedestal, untainted by the lust he was free to indulge elsewhere. For the woman, it was a psychological prison. She was told from birth that her body was a source of potential shame, not pleasure. Her natural feelings, if they dared to surface, were not a sign of life, but a symptom of moral decay or mental illness. Imagine the confusion, the silent shame of a young bride who discovered within herself the very feelings she had been taught were monstrous. She was trapped in a paradox. To be a desirable wife, she must be physically available to her husband. But to be a good wife, she must remain emotionally and spiritually detached from the act itself. It was a performance of passivity, a duty to be endured, not a union to be enjoyed. The marital bed was not a place of intimacy, but a place of sacrifice, where the angel in the house paid the price of her purity.
Rule number 2. If desire appears, it is a disease called hysteria.
But what happened when a woman could not or would not suppress her nature? What became of the woman who felt anxiety, depression, irritability, or, most dangerously of all, sexual frustration? The Victorian medical establishment had a ready-made answer, a diagnosis so broad and so terrifyingly vague that it could be applied to almost any female ailment: hysteria. The word itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. The ancient Greeks believed the uterus could wander throughout a woman's body, causing all manner of chaos. The Victorians, in their scientific arrogance, refined this ancient prejudice into a medical cudgel. The list of symptoms for hysteria was almost endless. It included faintness, nervousness, insomnia, fluid retention, shortness of breath, a tendency to cause trouble, and, of course, any sign of sexual fantasy or desire. In essence, any woman who deviated from the placid ideal of the angel in the house was at risk of being labeled a hysteric. It was a perfect tool for social control, a way to pathologize female dissent and discontent. The cures were as bizarre as the diagnosis. They ranged from the relatively benign, rest cures, bland diets, and prohibitions on stimulating activities like reading novels, to the truly invasive. Some women were subjected to institutionalization in asylums, where treatments could include hydrotherapy with ice-cold water or even surgical removal of the clitoris or ovaries, a brutal attempt to excise the very root of her malady. But the most common treatment was far stranger, and it reveals the profound hypocrisy at the heart of the era. Doctors discovered that bringing a patient to hysterical paroxysm, what we would now recognize as an orgasm, could temporarily relieve her symptoms. This was achieved through pelvic massage. Picture the scene: a respectable woman in the sterile, clinical environment of a doctor's office being manually stimulated by her physician as a form of medical treatment. The doctor, of course, viewed this as a tedious and purely clinical task, often complaining of the hand cramps it induced. It was a chore, not an intimate act. The patient, meanwhile, experienced a physical release that was forbidden to her in any other context. This tedious chore for doctors led directly to a world-changing invention. In the late 1880s, Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville invented the electromechanical vibrator. It was not marketed as a sex toy, but as a time-saving medical device to more efficiently induce paroxysm in his hysterical patients. It was heavy, loud, and powered by a wet cell battery, but it worked. For the first time, a machine could do what doctors had grown weary of. It was the ultimate Victorian paradox. The cure for a woman's unnatural desire was the mechanized fulfillment of it, all under the guise of sterile, passionless medicine.
Rule number 3: the sanctity of absolute ignorance. To ensure a woman remained pure, to prevent the dreaded onset of hysteria, it was deemed essential that she remain in a state of almost total ignorance about her own body and the mechanics of reproduction. A young, middle-class girl was raised in a cocoon of euphemism and silence. She would never be told where babies came from. She would learn nothing of menstruation until the day it happened, an event often experienced as a terrifying, bloody trauma. The act of sex itself was a horrifying mystery, referred to only in hushed, ominous tones, if at all. This cultivated ignorance was considered a hallmark of her innocence and, therefore, her value as a future wife. Perhaps no story illustrates the tragic consequences of this rule more vividly than the infamous marriage of the brilliant art critic John Ruskin and the beautiful Effie Gray. They were married in 1848. Ruskin was 29, Effie was 19. For 6 years, the marriage was a confusing and miserable sham. It was never consummated. Years later, when Effie sought an annulment, the shocking reason was revealed in her testimony. On their wedding night, John Ruskin, who had only ever seen women in the idealized forms of classical statues and paintings, was confronted with the reality of a real woman's body for the first time. He was, according to Effie's letters, utterly disgusted. He had imagined women to be smooth and beautiful like the marble statues, and was horrified to discover that Effie had pubic hair. This single natural detail so repulsed him that he could not bring himself to touch her. For 6 years, Effie lived in a state of profound emotional neglect, trapped in a marriage that was not a marriage at all. Ruskin, a genius in the world of art, was a casualty of his era's own manufactured ignorance. Effie was eventually granted an annulment on the grounds of his impotence, a public humiliation for both. Her ordeal highlights the cruelty of a system that prized an artificial, impossible ideal of purity over basic human knowledge and compassion, leading to untold private suffering. It demonstrates that ignorance, when sanctified, becomes a form of abuse. Rule number 4. The male prerogative and the great social evil. While the angel in the house was expected to be passionless, her husband, the Victorian gentleman, operated under an entirely different set of rules. For men, sexual desire was not a moral failing, but a biological necessity, a powerful, natural force that needed an outlet. It was widely believed that if a man did not regularly release his vital fluids, he could suffer from a range of ailments, from blindness to insanity. This created an impossible double standard. A man was expected to marry a pure, ignorant virgin, but he was also understood to have needs that she, in her angelic state, could not and should not be expected to fulfill. So, where was he to turn? The answer lay in the sprawling, hidden underworld of Victorian cities. It was an answer known as the great social evil, prostitution. Prostitution in the Victorian era was not a fringe activity. It was a massive, thriving industry, woven into the very fabric of society. It was the dark mirror to the chaste Victorian home. By some estimates, there were as many as 80,000 prostitutes working in London alone at the height of the period. They ranged from high-class courtesans who lived in lavish apartments and entertained the aristocracy, to the desperate dolly mops who sold themselves for the price of a meal or a place to sleep. For a young man, a visit to a brothel was often considered a rite of passage, a necessary part of his education before he settled down with a pure wife. For a married man, it was a discreet necessity, a way to protect his angel at home from his own base nature. This system was propped up by a wall of silent societal hypocrisy. Everyone knew it existed, but no one in polite society spoke of it. The cost of this hypocrisy was paid almost exclusively by the women involved. Plagued by disease, poverty, and violence, the life of a typical prostitute was brutal and short. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s gave police the right to arrest any woman suspected of being a prostitute and subject her to a forced, often violent, internal examination for venereal disease. No such laws applied to the men who were their clients, and who were, of course, the primary vectors of the diseases. The system was designed to make male indulgence safe and convenient while punishing the women who made it possible. The Victorian gentleman could maintain his public facade of respectability, while the woman he used was cast out, becoming a ghost in her own society, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of male privilege and domestic purity. Rule number 5. The mortal terror of solitary vice. If sex with a prostitute was a tolerated, if unacknowledged, vice, there was another sexual act that was viewed with a unique and profound horror. It was a secret sin, a private shame that required no partner, and was therefore seen as even more insidious. The Victorians called it self-pollution, self-abuse, or the solitary vice. We call it masturbation. A wave of moral panic, fueled by dubious medical theories and religious fervor, swept across Britain and America. Pamphlets with terrifying titles like Onania or A Timely Warning to the Young were widely distributed. They claimed that masturbation was not merely a sin, but a direct cause of a horrifying catalog of physical and mental diseases. According to these experts, the habitual masturbator could expect to suffer from epilepsy, blindness, memory loss, heart disease, and, most terrifying of all, insanity. The loss of semen was equated with a loss of life force. Each emission was seen as a step closer to the grave. Young men were taught to examine themselves for the supposed telltale signs: stooped posture, pale skin, acne, and hairy palms. This hysteria created a lucrative market for quacks and inventors who promised cures. The treatments were a testament to the era's cruelty. Boys might be forced to wear spermatic rings, metal devices with inward-facing spikes designed to cause pain upon arousal. Some were fitted with locked cages. Circumcision was promoted as a way to reduce sensitivity. In the most extreme cases, cauterization of the urethra was performed, the application of a hot iron to burn the nerves, a procedure of unimaginable agony. For young people growing up in this climate of fear, puberty became a time of intense anxiety and guilt. The most natural and harmless of explorations was transformed into a monstrous, soul-destroying habit. This obsession reveals more about the Victorians than it does about the act itself. It shows a deep-seated fear of pleasure for its own sake, a terror of any sexuality that existed outside the rigid confines of procreation and marital duty. It was a war waged not just on an act, but on the very idea of private, personal desire. Rule number 6, the language of utter concealment. In a society so terrified of sex, even the mere suggestion of it had to be eradicated from public life. This led to a culture of extreme and, to our modern eyes, utterly absurd prudishness. It was a rule that dictated not just actions, but words and even thoughts. The body itself became a source of shame. The word leg was considered too scandalous to be spoken in mixed company. One would refer to the limbs of a table or a piano. Famously, some households would even dress the limbs of their pianos in little frilled trousers, lest they provoke an improper thought. When asking for a piece of chicken at the dinner table, one would request dark meat or white meat, as the words breast or thigh were far too suggestive. Pregnancy was the ultimate unmentionable. A pregnant woman was in a delicate condition or in the family way. She would go into confinement in the later stages, effectively disappearing from public view so as not to offend society with the visible evidence of a sexual act. This obsession with concealment created a secret world of coded communication. For lovers bound by the strict rules of courtship, a whole vocabulary of nonverbal signals emerged. The language of the fan allowed a woman to send messages across a crowded ballroom. A fan placed near the heart meant, "You have won my love." Hiding the eyes behind an open fan meant, "I love you." Similarly, floriography, the language of flowers, became immensely popular. A suitor could send a whole conversation in a single bouquet. A red chrysanthemum meant, "I love." A yellow carnation meant disdain. But a striped carnation meant, "No, I cannot be with you," a gentle, silent refusal. This was a world of whispers, of hidden meanings and subtle gestures. On the surface, it appears romantic, but it was born of repression. It was a system created because direct, honest communication about feelings and desires was impossible. It was a beautiful, intricate cage, one that kept passion contained within the safe, silent language of flowers and fans, far from the dangerous world of actual words and deeds. Rule number 7, marital duty, the joyless command. And so we arrive at our final destination, the Victorian marital bed. We have seen how the woman was to be pure and ignorant, and the man was to be worldly and experienced. We have seen the anxieties and hypocrisies that swirled around them. Here, in this most private of spaces, all these contradictions came to a head. For the woman, sex was, by its very definition, not supposed to be an act of love or intimacy. It was a marital duty. It was her obligation to submit to her husband's needs, both to satisfy his biological urges and, crucially, to produce heirs. The advice given to young brides by their mothers, if any was given at all, was often famously summarized in the phrase, "Close your eyes and think of England." This was not a cynical joke. It was a genuine survival strategy. It framed the act of sex as a patriotic, selfless sacrifice for the good of the family and the empire. Pleasure was not part of the equation. Indeed, for a woman to show enjoyment was suspect. It might suggest she was not the angel she was supposed to be, that she harbored the same base instincts as a fallen woman. Therefore, the ideal wedding night was often a silent, fumbling, and sometimes traumatic affair. The act was meant to be performed quickly, efficiently, and with as little passion as possible, often under the cover of complete darkness and with both parties still swaddled in layers of night clothes. This joyless, functional approach to intimacy had devastating consequences. It created marriages that were emotionally hollow, built on duty rather than connection. It left women feeling like vessels, their bodies used for a purpose they barely understood and from which they were forbidden to derive pleasure. It left men, too, in a state of isolation, unable to connect with their wives on a truly intimate level, often driving them back to the shadow world of prostitution to find a passion they could not find at home. The Victorian bed was, for many, the loneliest place in the world. It was the final tragic theater where all the era's bizarre and damaging rules were played out, night after night, in silence and in darkness. The world of the Victorians can feel very distant to us now, a strange and theatrical chapter of the past. It is easy to look back with a sense of superiority, to marvel at their anxieties and laugh at their absurdities, like covering the legs of a piano. But the echoes of these 7 rules have not entirely faded. The struggle between public image and private reality, the policing of female desire, the damaging consequences of sexual ignorance, and the persistence of the double standard, these are not relics of a bygone era. They are ghosts that still haunt our modern world in more subtle but no less significant ways. The Victorians were not monsters. They were people, just like us, trapped in a complex web of religious belief, emerging science, and rigid social pressures. They were striving for an ideal of order and moral perfection, and in doing so, they inflicted profound and lasting wounds upon themselves and each other. Their story is a quiet and often heartbreaking reminder that beneath any facade of elegance and propriety, the messy, complicated, and powerful truth of human nature will always be waiting. Waiting to be understood, waiting to be accepted, and waiting finally to be set free from the rules of silence.